Our main presenter today is a member of our own community. Richard Andrews has given several talks at Oasis before. They've been very well received, very educational and interesting. And today his title is The Science of Peace. Philosophers have long pondered the question of why humans engage in systematic violence, especially large-scale wars. Let's welcome Richard Andrews.
Hey, folks. Let's see. I call it a work in progress because I consider myself an amateur in this area, actually. But it's one of those things that we better get. We all better get better at this. A little bit of background. Even though some of you may think you know me, I'm actually a trained killer, unfortunately. So what's so funny? So. I grew up on a U.S. naval base in Spain because that's where my parents were working, and I moved over there when I was a year old. I then went to college in Germany for a couple years on an army base again. So I was around the military, my entire formative period. And later, after college, I joined the Navy. And my Navy career was that I went to officer candidate school, and then after that I went to something called Surface Warfare Officer School, and where you learn basically all about how to fight wars on ships and whatnot, and studied a variety of different topics. And then I spent 15 months on a ship in the Middle East. This was before the Iraq War stuff. And then I changed ships, and I was going to be sent to something called Tactical Action Officer School, which is a school where you get into even more depth, more sophisticated knowledge about how to wage war, how to kill people. And that's when I decided, and I'd been thinking about this for a while, that's when I decided that I really didn't believe this stuff, and I would rather patch people up than blow people up, basically. So I informed the Navy of my opinion, which was not well received. And but there is an official process for getting out of the military, even after you're already in it. And so I engaged in that bureaucratic process. It was rejected the first time, and then I sent in an appeal. And after 6 months, they said, okay, we believe you. And I was let out with an honorable discharge. I grew up in Spain. As I said, it's a beautiful country. It does have a troubled past in some ways. And it had a fascist dictatorship until 1975, and that's when Franco died and democracy came in. And Franco, for those of you who have studied history or lived through it, he helped Hitler and Mussolini. Now, this was before World War II, and then Hitler and Mussolini helped Franco. And after the war, after World War II, basically most of the countries in the world, especially those that had participated in World War II fighting against the fascists, ignored Spain, and Spain was a pariah in the international community until the United States in the early 50s, in an effort to fight communism, decided to make friends with Franco and send in hundreds of millions of dollars worth of weapons and my family. And but of course, as a child growing up, you don't know any of that, some of my formative stuff, Lou mentioned the idea of cognitive dissonance earlier, so I'm going to pick up on that theme. Some of my cognitive dissonance. At 17, when I was working with some Spanish co-workers on the base there. I did that for a couple summers in a row. Very nice, very friendly people. I mean, the Spanish in general are very friendly. And then at one point, after I had already become friends with them, they came up with some shocking commentary. It had to do with male-female relations and so on and so forth, and what you would do if you found your partner having an affair or whatever. If you had an affair, that wouldn't be so bad, but if you found your partner having an affair, how would you respond? And they responded with some violent commentary that really shocked me. But what the cognitive dissonance was that they were already my friends, and I already knew they were nice people. In other words, they were normal, regular old people, and yet they had these violent strains. So that was something that I've kind of wrestled with ever since then. And I guess it's similar to what, was it Hannah Arendt, or who was the philosopher or the writer? Somebody here can mention that. Somebody after World War II, when reviewing the transcripts after the Nuremberg war trials, and there was a prominent Nazi called Adolf Eichmann, who seemed like just a regular old guy. And so that was referred to by a writer as the banality of evil. In other words, sort of the normal everydayness of evil, And of course, as a secular person and as a scientific person or somebody who's quasi-scientific, I don't really believe in evil. There isn't some cloud that kind of floats in from outer space and some people get infected with evil and some people don't. That just doesn't make any sense from a scientific point of view, and yet that's what we tend to believe. And then I was also very influenced by video footage of the civil rights workers and of Gandhi and the followers of Gandhi in India and other places where you actually get trained in how to do active resistance with nonviolence, an amazingly powerful tool, and people getting hit over the head and that kind of stuff, and making a conscious decision that they were not going to fight back, and yet those had generated policy successes that were very impressive, I thought. And the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr., I imagine all of you have seen that, regarded by scholars of public speaking as the #1 talk in the 20th century, and with good reason. This is Guernica. The first spelling is how you spell it in the Basque language. This is in the Basque part of Spain up in the north. And the second spelling is the Spanish spelling, the one that is more familiar. This is what the town looked like. Now, it didn't have any military importance. This was 1937, before World War II, during the Spanish Civil War, when Franco invited the Nazis and the Italian fascists to come in and firebomb the town, just as a way to practice their bombing runs and that sort of thing, and because it was an inconvenient town that was opposing Franco and his forces. And then starting about 6 days later, Picasso was approached to do a painting about this, and he was living in Paris at the time. And it took him a month to do this painting, and of course it's considered one of the most famous paintings of all time, very powerful. At one point when he was living in Paris and the Nazi Gestapo were in town because they had taken over France, and a Gestapo officer asked him, "Did you do this?" And Picasso reportedly said, "No, you did." George Orwell, who fought in the Spanish Civil War, the guy that wrote 1984 and other books, he made this comment, because what I'm talking about here relates entirely to the science of us versus them, how we define outgroups and how we respond to outgroups. And I think there's a science behind that. And again, rather than thinking that somebody who, and we've all done this, of course, we all have mechanisms in our brain that quickly define who's an us and who's a them, and then we tend to be a little bit suspicious of the thems, and we define that in various ways, which we'll talk about. So everyone believes in the atrocities of the other side and disbelieves in the atrocities of our own side. Jane Goodall was a very famous primatologist, and she was the first one to document long-term warfare, 4 years long, between two different chimpanzee groups who systematically hunted each other. One group was the dominant group, one group was the splinter group, and the dominant group eventually wiped out, again, in a very planned, systematic way, something that we think of as being entirely a human activity, but it turns out other species that are a lot like us do the same thing. I've always said that we are slightly sophisticated gorillas, and this is interesting. Those of you who have heard some of my previous talks know that I'm interested in addiction, for example, among other things. And it turns out that the adrenaline rush of war, even though war is horrible, many soldiers and even journalists of war correspondents have reported that when they're not, even though they hate being in that setting, when they're not in that setting, and when they're in a context like working at McDonald's or whatever it is, where you don't have that constant rush and every single thing you do is important and vital, and then you're in another setting, it seems really boring, and you want to get back into that. So that's another mechanism, perhaps, of war. This is something that I was kind of intrigued by. I'm always intrigued when somebody successfully reaches out to an other, and it's an important model, I think. This is from Kenya. This was a Muslim cleric who started a thing called yellow houses of worship, where people from different faiths, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, will get together and jointly paint each of their houses of worship yellow in some way to show the commonalities between their faiths rather than the difference. I thought that was a pretty cool model. Bihar Prison in New Delhi, India. Again, I'm trying to find examples from the real world of where you can sort of reach out to the other and successfully make connections. There was a woman put in charge of the prison. Usually, of course, it was the old boys network. But here a woman was put in charge of one of the most notorious prisons in India, with the really hardcore murderers and whatnot in the prison, a high recidivism rate. And because she wasn't part of the old boy network, she was trying to figure out how to do things differently and improve conditions at the prison. And one of the guards, who I think was Buddhist, suggested doing this Vipassana technique. You can find a nice video on this online. And so she said, sure, because, she was trying new things. And so they introduced this Vipassana meditation technique, which was voluntary on the part of the guards and the prisoners, but a number of them took part. Eventually, 1,000 of them took part at one time. And they spent 10 days learning how to do meditation and learning in particular how to recognize the automaticity, the automatic nature of our negative responses to things. Somebody insults you and immediately you're ready to get into a fight with them. And that's, in fact, where the fights were coming from within the prison walls. And so they learned when it was an automatic biological thing rather than I decided to get upset, And not to say that it was universally successful, but for many of them it was successful. And it led first of all, to reduced violence within the prison. But it also led, in a few cases, to the victims' families of the murderers. Murderers had murdered somebody, obviously, and then they started communicating in some cases with the victims' families, and in some cases the victims' families actually forgave them because they recognized this was a genuinely changed person who was able to not respond in an automatic fashion and able to express remorse for what they had done. Do genes explain psychopaths and that kind of violent behavior? Well, sort of. Yes, there are individual genes that can be identified that correlate, let's say, with increased behavior and with psychopathic behavior, in fact. But it's never the gene by itself that does this. Even if you have one of those genes, in some cases, in the particular case of this one gene, you can watch this TED Talk, and anybody who wants a copy of these slides, by the way, I'm happy to send it to them. In children who have had significant child abuse, only then might that gene express itself as psychopathic behavior. This is somebody who was Jim Fallon, a neuroscientist, who was asked to review a bunch of brains, to do brain studies and try to identify, because this was a blinded study where he was asked to try to identify what was different about psychopath brains and normal brains. And he did, in fact, find some differences, and he would go around talking about it. And then one day his mother pulled him aside and said, "Oh, by the way, have you looked at our own family history?" And it turns out he was related to Lizzie Borden, a very famous murderer. And when he looked through his family tree, he found a lot of murderers. And then he started identifying genes within the family and who has the gene and who doesn't and that kind of stuff. But again, genes by themselves, yes, they can be important, but they virtually never, at least in the case of this kind of complex behavior, by themselves identify what's going on. It's a complicated thing. This is a fascinating podcast called Conversations with People Who Hate Me. This guy, Dylan Marin, will identify, some of you have heard the podcasts? No. So he will identify people, I guess by going online and saying things, and then people will troll you and stuff like that. And he, deliberately identifies them and has conversations with them, and he finds that just the humanizing effect of just respecting the other person regardless of what they said at the beginning and that kind of stuff, and he finds that frequently they modify their tone quite a bit. Another example is this woman, Mary Beard in England, a prominent classics professor, and she, in addition to doing all of her classics work, she also goes online, has a big online presence, and will get into discussions with people about politics and one thing or another. And a lot of people will, again, write violent or very negative comments, and she loves to engage them, but she does it, again, in a respectful way and just keeps trying to find out where they're coming from and that kind of stuff. And eventually, it's very common for the people who used to be bitterly attacking her to become her defenders, in fact. So I'm a big believer in reaching out to the other side. Starting a war, when nations want to start wars, or certain politicians in nations want to start wars, they'll often start using memes. And when fighting the Japanese in World War II, it was the yellow man. And you've heard the term perhaps gooks, which has been used in a number of wars, not only Vietnam. And when I was in the Navy over in the Middle East, the sailors would frequently refer to the local citizens as ragheads because they wore cloth on their heads and stuff like that. These derogatory terms that make it easier for our brain to identify who's the other against whom we should have negative feelings and that kind of thing. So, under certain circumstances, it appears, these war memes get switched on and they help populations develop sort of pro-war feelings. I'm always amazed whenever the U.S., which is rather common, unfortunately, starts to beat the war drums. It's always amazing to see how an incredibly high percentage of the population initially, even up to 90%, supports this. It's an absolutely biological phenomenon that's occurring at the population level, at the group level. And then after a while, when you start hearing about some of the untruths and so on and so forth, then suddenly the support for the war starts dwindling off quite rapidly. But initially, it's an absolutely biological thing, I think. I mentioned grasshoppers and locusts because a similar thing occurs with grasshoppers and locusts. Locusts are basically a species of grasshopper, and they spend most of their existence as solitary insects, but then when the population density gets too high, they undergo physical and behavioral changes. They get physically larger, their color changes, their behavior changes, and they start swarming as a population. And this is where all those famous locust stories of famines and so on and so forth, it's because of high population density and pressures, and then they go off and eat all the food. So I think something similar happens. Maybe we don't get larger and change color and so on and so forth, but I think something similar happens with human populations. Robert Sapolsky is a fascinating primatologist, and he has written a lot about this. His latest book is called Behave, the biological underpinnings of our worst and best behavior. And I'm still in the middle of it, although there's a number of TED Talks and other online talks by Robert Sapolsky that I strongly encourage you to look at. He talks about the process of individuating other people or de-individuating them. In other words, it's one thing when you can take a whole group, especially after you use a meme like the yellow man or raghead or gooks, then you're identifying that whole other group, and then it's easier for our brain to dislike the other group. But when you start singling out individuals and getting to know them as individuals, then it's a little bit harder, and the brain, it's not as easy for the brain, because then the brain is recognizing that that's an us, rather than a them. So, and there's these things called pseudo-kinship, pseudo-speciation. That's just another aspect of the us versus them. Pseudo-speciation is where, by using memes and by other mechanisms, we regard the other as beneath us, as not like us, they eat different food, they smell funny, blah, blah, blah. I don't like their music. Again, it's another it's pseudo-speciation because it's as if they were a different species. Why Your Brain, he's got a nice talk online called Why Your Brain Hates Other People, which I encourage you to look at. Now, the amygdala, you've heard about the amygdala. The amygdala is a little part of our brain. It's the shape and roughly the size of an almond, and it responds in 1/20th of a second. That's how long it takes for the amygdala to make a decision that somebody else is an other rather than an us. That happens in 1/20th of a second. So we're going to do a little experiment here. Jahan's going to help me. So we'll do a visual on what 1/20th of a second is like. So if this whole thing is 1 second, then this is the 1/20th portion here. That's how long it takes for your brain to make a decision that somebody else is an other, and they should be feared or attacked or hated or whatever. So the brain does, and some people would say that that's depressing. I actually think the more we learn about these real world mechanisms, I find it kind of optimistic actually, because if we don't find mechanisms explaining some of these behaviors and thoughts that we have, then we have to believe that it's some nebulous cloud that floats in from outer space and people just wake up one morning and decide to be evil or something like that, which doesn't make any sense. Now, the optimistic side of it also is after the amygdala, which wants to, in other words, it may save you when you respond instantly to the tiger or the snake or whatever it is. So this is an instinctive reaction. But then after the amygdala, very rapidly, 50 milliseconds, after it makes that decision, then the cognitive parts of the brain, which developed later, all right, then they come in and say, you're being silly, this is obviously not a different species, and so on and so forth, So I think the more we can learn about that and rely on it, then rather than thinking we're going to get rid of the amygdala, all right, that's not going to work, okay? So we have to just deal with it and maybe find mechanisms like individuating other people, getting to know them as individuals, so that we can prevent war. In other words, the emotions come first and then the rationalizations come later. First we have this deep-seated feeling and we don't know where it came from, and then we say, well, it's because I don't like the way they dress, or I don't like their language. In Proverbs, the Bible, of course, has a couple different sort of schizophrenic on this. Rejoice not when thine enemy falleth, and let not thine heart be glad when he stumbleth. But on the other hand, you're going to wash your blood in the feet of the wicked. I don't know why you'd want to wash your blood in the feet of the wicked, or in the blood of the wicked. And then I thought this was fascinating. I call this Discrimination 101, a passage in the Bible where it actually gives instructions on which word you should use to ask the thems how to say this word, and if they mispronounce it, then you kill them. It's real straightforward, So Discrimination 101. In terms of systems, now I think part of the science of peace has to involve studying how systems work and interact. And of course, one of the most famous lines regarding systems was by former President Eisenhower, who had also been a top military general. And he warned us very famously about the military-industrial complex, which I think is a real phenomenon. And a lot of times it isn't just, some policy decision where it's a good idea for us to invade this other country. A lot of times it's because of this mechanism where, companies are trying to sell weapons and that sort of thing. So bits and pieces here. Vietnam War by Ken Burns. If you haven't seen this series, it's phenomenal. It's hard to watch in some ways, but it's also a study in how wars get started, how wars get justified, and you'll see a lot of us-theming type stuff in there. Some of the things I'm concerned about are with the rise of artificial intelligence, the use of autonomous weapons, the idea that we're going to turn over decisions about who to shoot and when to blow things up. We're going to turn it over to artificial intelligence. Well, we've been learning recently that artificial intelligence, of course, has built-in biases. Even though it's this incredibly smart stuff, whoever programmed it, they build in certain biases. And do we really want artificial intelligence to be making these decisions? Nuclear accidents, and with this president in particular, we have to worry about stuff like this. I grew up in Spain in 1966. a plane carrying 4 hydrogen bombs, incredibly powerful bombs, far more powerful than the bombs that were dropped on Japan. And they were refueling and had an accident in the air, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell onto Spain. And it could have been an absolute disaster. 2 of them actually exploded. But it turns out that was just the conventional part of the bomb. It wasn't the nuclear part of the bomb. You know, you have to have a conventional explosive, which then triggers the chain reaction that makes the hydrogen bomb blow off. But it could have been an absolute catastrophe with millions of people dying, and it was all because, you know, because we insist on having this mechanism in place for fighting the thems, even though we don't really know who the thems are. So this is Guernica's Peace Museum. I'm going to go there in September and see, just because I'm interested in, this is a town that has become kind of a center for peace studies and whatnot, so I'm going to go there in September, and maybe I can talk to you about that a little bit after that. Thank you.
Got time for about 2 questions. Stephen, and can I get one other hand? All right, right next to each other. That's easy.
Good morning, Dr. Williams. Thank you very much for your presentation. Obviously, you're preaching to choir here about how destructive and really waste of national treasure wars can be. My question is, this is something I've always wondered. You know, obviously not, you know, there's been a lot of anti-war veterans out there, but in discussing, questioning the Iraq War and back in the Vietnam, there are some people here in the United States that somehow confuse questioning a foreign policy decision, questioning marching against Dick Cheney and George W. Bush and the members of Congress who voted for the authorization, to insulting the troops and not appreciating the sacrifice. Even when I make it very personally crystal clear to some of my friends, say, look, I am not bashing your service. I am not bashing the regular troops who are doing the best they can. My beef is strictly with the policymakers. It's almost like they want to get in a fight over it. Like they literally want to punch me in the face just because and it's like this. In order to appreciate their sacrifice, it's like we have to shut up about whether or not this is a good policy. And is there any way you can comment on that kind of extreme confusion?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, this is why I sort of embarked on this personal study, I suppose, is I don't know exactly what is the best way to approach somebody so that they don't regard me as the them. And, you know, if I can instead, you know, express not necessarily agreement with their views, but at least respect for their process of, you know, I mean, they're another human, and they may be, in my opinion, mistaken about something, but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't respect them as individuals. I'm not sure what the best way is. Maybe together we can learn what that process is, and yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
Well, I noticed on one of the slides the term insula, and what is its relationship to the amygdala and this topic? Could you refresh me on that, please?
Between the amygdala and... Oh, the insula. Oh, yeah, the insula, I didn't mention, I mean, the insula was on the slide. The insula is a fascinating part of our brain, and it's, you know, the amygdala is sort of the fear and anxiety center, right? The insula is another relatively primitive part of the brain that is our disgust center. Whether it's a taste, a smell, another person, it's the part of our brain that processes our disgust or is responsible for our disgust reaction. And it turns out that when you're disgusted by another person, usually a them, of course, it turns out that that's processed in exactly the same way as a disgust reaction to food or something like that. And of course, that disgust reaction, again, it's a primitive protective mechanism that you need. You need a mechanism that tells you when something might be poisonous or might be contaminated. But of course, the brain will often, you know, this is the way evolution works, right? Something is developed with one purpose, and then other other activities will then hijack the existing mechanism and make use of it. So when you're disgusted by another person, that's the same exact part of our brain, the insula, that is governing that mechanism. So I think we just have to recognize that, and take it into account. I'm hoping that we can get better at peacemaking and having fewer thems, fewer out-groups when we understand the underlying mechanisms. How do we, in other words, instead of just relying on the amygdala and the insula to define how we're going to respond to other people, we try to emphasize those more modern parts of the brain that do cognitive processing and think our way through it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Richard Andrews.